So thanks for being with us here on a beautiful Wednesday afternoon, at least here in Minnesota. The sun is shining, which I don't often get to say when we are hosting webinars. I'm Amy Scotchless-Cole. I'm the president of Trust in Food at Farm Journal. Trust in Food is the purpose-driven part of our organization that really helps partner with ranchers and farmers and growers to support them and the organizations around them in helping take the next steps on their conservation agriculture journey. So I'm super excited to be here this afternoon with two of our close collaborators to be talking about grazing management and grazing management planning. So let me introduce Susan. I'm not sure I see slides yet, so if I am wrong, you let me know. Uh, I would love to introduce our two folks who are with us. First, Steve Wooten. So here we go. Looks like slides are coming up. Steve is a cattle rancher who runs the Beatty Canyon Ranch in southeastern Colorado. Steve is a past chair of the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. He also represents the Colorado Cattlemen's Group. Steve's ranch dates back in his family to 1929 when his dad bought it. And he is going to serve here both as the owner-operator of his ranch as well as an expert on grazing management planning. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you.
I also want to introduce my friend, Dr. Samantha Worth. Dr. Worth is the executive director of the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, who has been fearlessly leading the charge on helping the organization set its goals, its 2030 goals, and then figure out a plan of action that coordinates across many different sectors in order to make those happen. So welcome, Sam. Glad to have you here. So we are talking today about grazing management planning. So let's just start at the very beginning and level set. Steve, would you just talk us through when we talk about grazing management planning, what is it that we're talking about? And from a rancher's perspective, why does it matter?
Thank you, Amy. I think we've all heard the term, you can't manage what you don't measure. And I think that's the basis or the very root of grazing management. In these times when we've spent almost 30 years in some sort of a drought-afflicted range in western part of the United States, it's become extremely important to be careful with what we're doing on our resources, because under stress such as drought, they're very easily denuded and hurt. And with a grazing management plan, you're actually striving to create resiliency by keeping a healthy plant ecosystem out there and a very diverse ecosystem instead of a monoculture. You're creating diversity that responds quicker when drought is broken, or in a normal pattern, it's increasing itself. It's increasing diversity of species, of different levels of species. And so it's something about recording that. It's easy to look at it, but if you're like me, and I think a lot of others are, if I don't write it down, if I don't take pictures of it, I don't have something to refer to. What did it look like 5 years ago? It's easy to remember what last year looked like. So that written element of it helps you track continuous improvement. And with that, what we've seen in our operation after almost 30 years of working with grazing management, but really cranked it up in the last 20 years due to the stresses of challenges of drought, is we've seen our diversity increase when we get adequate precipitation, winter or summer or both. We see a quicker response, and that's in large part due to our philosophy of we have to have longer rest periods. We have to give those plants more time to store energy in their roots, regrow their leaf, and be ready for another grazing by our cattle. The other aspect of it, the stewardship side of it, being good stewards of the land, it has opened up opportunities for us to lease other operations and extend our cattle operation, because they know that we're going to take good care of it. They're going to get reports at least annually, if not a couple of times a year, of where the cattle are, how frequently the cattle are being moved, what are the goals within certain areas of the ranch. And that all combined with that holistic philosophy of taking care of grazing management also tends to apply to wildlife management as well as recreational management. And when you kind of combine all those together and you begin to look at it as one whole process, you have opportunities that open up, and it may not necessarily only be in cattle production. It may be some of the others, such as ecosystem services. It may be carbon contracts that we're starting to see a lot of opportunities for rangeland managers to get into the carbon market. And so those are all factors that contribute to the potential for profitability with a well-written plan, something that has teeth and merit to it, and accountability.
That is incredibly helpful. I love the part and hadn't really, I don't think people focus on what opportunities come to you or are available to you when you demonstrate that you are, in the business of taking care of the assets that underpin your business, like the grass that your cattle are feeding on. So that is super helpful. So Sam, talk to us a little bit, introduce us to the roundtable, and talk to us a little bit about why grazing management planning has been an important element for the roundtable to focus on.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me on. It's good to be here with you guys today. Um, so the Roundtable is a multi-stakeholder organization. We were formed back in 2015, and we span the entire beef value chain. So we have cow-calf producers like Steve and his family, all the way through retail and food service companies that we're working with alongside civil society groups, which include university organizations as well as nonprofit organizations, and then allied industry groups that all come together essentially with the common mission to support, advance, and communicate continuous improvement of sustainability across the U.S. beef value chain. So we're really hoping to move the needle on sustainability for the U.S. beef supply chain, helping us to become a global leader around environmentally sound, socially responsible, and economically viable beef. And so if we go to the next slide here, just kind of some background. We actually just celebrated our 10-year anniversary here 2 weeks ago in Fort Worth. So we were founded in 2015 with over 94 founding members. And the first thing that we really wanted to do as an entire supply chain was think through what are the critical areas that we can all be working in, where every single sector, from cow-calf producers all the way through to a retail food service company, where can we be working within our own sectors, but then across the supply chain to be making a difference. And so we landed on, we narrowed it down, I think, from probably thousands to like 150, and then to 6 key indicators that every single sector can take ownership of. You'll see them here. And those include the air and greenhouse gas emissions, land resources, water resources, employee safety and well-being, animal health and well-being, and efficiency and yield. So those are all things that anyone, can you go back, please? Anyone in any entity, from on a ranch to in a restaurant, right? You can be taking ownership and doing something to advance in sustainability. So if you go back one more slide again, from establishing those 6 indicator areas, we also work to develop metrics. So within those indicators, what are those key metrics that we want to think about to help guide how we make decisions around those indicators. And from there, we have really focused in as a roundtable on tools and resources that help support each segment of the industry on making those decisions, being as informed as they can be, and as up to date with the science-based evidence that we have available. And so that stems from those self-assessment guides to different modules and different tools. And that's kind of culminated in more of our recent work, which has been in 2022. When I came on board, we launched our industry-wide sustainability goals. So we launched overarching goals across those 6 indicator areas and then set targets for each sector. And we've been working basically since 2022 on kind of fulfilling those goals and targets. And so now if we go to the next slide, one thing that's really important is with those sector metrics that I mentioned is that each sector set those metrics for themselves and really define what are the most important things that we can be doing under each of those indicator areas. And so for the cow-calf sector, when you think about what's the key thing that we can be doing around air and greenhouse gas emissions or our land resources and water resources, it's thinking about grazing management planning. So that key question you ask yourself is, do we have a grazing management plan that's been implemented that's prioritizing or thinking about improving soil and plant community health and land and water resources? So by having a grazing management plan, you're able to set goals around those different things, right? To think through what are we prioritizing around our soil and plant community health? What are we thinking about with the land, the environment, the water? And how do we leverage our grazing strategies to help us improve there? So that's been a key metric for the cow-calf sector across those 3 indicator areas from the foundation of the roundtable as an area where we really like to focus efforts. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see here just an overarching summary of all of our goals that I mentioned. So again, we launched those back in 22. And if you go to the next slide, the main target for our cow-calf sector is that we are hoping to achieve 385 million acres of covered, or sorry, 85 million acres covered under written grazing management plans by 2050. So that is a massive goal that our cow-calf sector has set for themselves. So this was done thinking through looking at, we have about over 600 million acres today that we graze in the US. And so this is about 2/3 of grazing lands that we're operating on. And so the idea here is, can we work to conserve as much of those grazing lands as possible? And so this has been a huge effort that we've now been working with across the roundtable and with partners like Trust in Food, Trust in Beef to figure out, one, where are we at with grazing management? Because like Steve just said, we can't manage what we can't measure. So first thing that was really important for the roundtable is understanding how many acres do we actually have under written grazing management plans. And then the second layer is understanding where there aren't plans, what's the opportunity? How do we help support producers and meet them where they're at to help understand what are the different resources that could be helpful for them so that they are able to implement a plan and use the right sort of tools and techniques that are going to benefit them pending where they're at. So I think I have one more slide. Our first kind of step, in addition to working with Trust in Food, Trust in Beef on kind of helping to understand the lay of the land, was to develop a module and a template around grazing management planning. So there are tons of resources out there around grazing management planning, and you can really go down several rabbit holes if you want to, but it gets intense really quickly, right? So what we wanted to do was figure out, how do we just get to the basics? How do we provide just a solid foundation for producers who are interested in just learning a little bit more on grazing management plans? And so that's what this module that we created does. We worked with producers, including Steve, and experts around the country to help kind of develop a module that is founded on these 6 key areas that we focus on around farm and ranch resource inventory, goals and objectives for the ranch, stocking rate, pasture utilization, wildlife inventory, and then contingency planning as kind of those 6 key things that we think about as just that foundational grazing management plan. And then we provide resources and the ability for, if you want to dive deeper into any of these areas, you can. And so that's kind of been our first step of let's get started. So
that is a fabulous overview. Thanks, Sam. Okay, so I'll pick up the story here a little bit. And that is, we we had been working together through our Trust in Beef initiative, and Trust in Beef is really about how do we help connect producers to their resources that are useful for them in taking their conservation journeys. And so grazing management planning is a big part of that. BQA is a big part of that, working with, in the entire set of practices around great animal handling and welfare, as well as communicating that up and down the value chain. So that was fun, but you guys came to us with a little bit of a quandary. And the quandary was we set this goal about having 385 million acres under a grazing management plan by 2050, but we don't know how many acres are under a plan today, right? And this was a really fun challenge for the Trust and Food team, because one of the things that we love to do is look at the data that we have available in the Farm Journal world, and then figure out how can we help put that information to work to help groups like yours, put additional acres under conservation. So if you'll go to the next slide, Susan. What we actually did, this was sort of a first for us at Trust and Food, because we actually created a methodology together to actually provide what I start to call like a non-observable data set about conservation behaviors. And so we all know there are great satellites out there that can look across landscapes and see what kinds of practices are happening on them. But some of our most important conservation practices, like a grazing management plan, are not something that a satellite can see from space. It's also really impractical to go and ask every single human being who has cattle on their ranch or in their pasture to tell us what that looks like. And so together, what we did was come up with a methodology that sent out thousands of surveys to understand both who had grazing management plans, what those plans looked like, and how they were using them. And then, because at Farm Journal we have over 5,000 data points per producer that we work with, we were actually able to create a really good estimate of who had grazing management plans and who didn't. And then we were able to validate that against the information that we had gathered sort of in real life, self-reported information from producers. And when we got to the end of that, we gave you a little bit of a scary headline, right? And that was you were only 11% of your way to the goal of having 385 million acres under a written grazing management plan by 2050. So 44 million acres or so being managed by producers under a written grazing management plan. I think we probably all had a little bit of our jaw drop moment when we saw that, right? But let's go to the next slide. And this is where the process really got fun, because one of the things that the subject matter group was able to identify is that there are probably more producers who have a plan in their head but haven't taken the step of writing it down. And so we were fortunate when we went out to gather information that we looked at that as well. And that changed the picture for us pretty dramatically. What we found was that about 50% of all cattle ranchers told us that they do have a grazing management plan, but 40% of those are storing it in their heads. And so when we looked at this, one of the things that you asked us to do was say, okay, like, how do we take this forward, knowing that the job is not to start from zero to get all of those acres under a grazing management plan, but actually to facilitate ranchers in getting it written down and in demonstrating that that has some value to them to doing so. It was a really interesting discovery as we looked down at the acres, and we'll sort of get into what we did with that information. I'm going to take a quick pause to just call out to those of you who are listening to this webinar. There's a Q&A box down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may have to squiggle your mouse a little bit, or a chat. We would love to hear from you on questions as we go, and we'll try to answer them. We'll also leave a little bit of time at the end. But okay, as we look at this, one of the questions that comes up, I think, is we talked a little bit about the importance of writing it down. Steve sort of gave us some good context of that. How are you going to remember what it looked like 5 years ago? Human brains are fallible. But I think one of the things that comes up is it's just a plan. It doesn't actually mean that you're doing anything differently or that you're promising to do anything at all. I think we've heard that as a little bit of a criticism or a hot take on this goal. We've got some data that might suggest otherwise. So Susan, if you'll go to the next slide for us. So one of the questions that we looked at together was, okay, if you have a plan, are you using it? And what we found was that almost 90%, 89% of ranchers, whether the plan was written down or not, told us that they are using those plans to make decisions. So, okay, so they're using it. Does that line up with what you all have seen in the work that you're doing with ranchers? Steve, when you're out talking to ranchers about the benefits of grazing management plans, even if they have them in their head, are you seeing them use it as a management tool rather than a piece of paper on the shelf? You have to come off mute.
I'm sorry. Amy, in the last 20, 25 years, I think yes. And I talked about the stressors that have induced that. And as a part of a grazing management plan in the Western United States, a drought mitigation plan tied with that. So you might have all the moves in your head where you want to use pastures this year, but then the other side of that is a plan to what you're going to do if all of a sudden forage doesn't match the number of cattle on the ranch. And I think that's been the one driving force to where using their plans, yes, because they're watching what's happening to that forage inventory, and it causes you to get thinking ahead. What's the date line that we're going to have to be able to do something with the cows or make some changes in it? And the two of them working together is a really valuable tool.
No, I did it. I think you talked about something that feels like a little bit of a misconception, and maybe everybody that we have on this webinar understands the intricacies of cattle ranching, but just to say aloud, a grazing management plan is not just a natural resource plan, is it? It's actually about marketing decisions and economic decisions and stocking rates and things like that, right? And so talk a little bit about sort of the economic value that a plan might have.
Well, and I'll go back and refer to the drought mitigation plan. So you're at a point, you're in a drought year, and your forage isn't going to make it all the way through. What you don't want to have to do is have a crisis liquidation of a certain part of your operation, whether it's the older cows or the young cows, or can you get your calves to their target date of age that you want to market? If you've got a plan that if XYZ starts to happen, then these are the dates that we will make that happen. That allows you to get as much value out of the cattle at the time that you liquidate them, whether they're the cows that didn't breed back, whether they're a certain age of cows that you've made a decision that in your operation that they're the first to leave. And the whole goal there may be to make sure that those calves that are going to go across the scale have the opportunity to utilize the most of your available resources so that when that check is written over the scale, they come close to meeting what you need from them. So the economic of it is try to find ways, even in a challenging environment, try to find ways to capitalize on the value of different ages and different classes of the cattle on your operation, and then market them ahead of crisis. Even 3 months ahead of a problem may create more value than waiting until you just have to do it.
You have to do something. Yep. Yep. Fabulous. So sort of same question to you, Sam. We've heard from the conservation side, like, oh, do plants make any difference on the ground? Really, from a conservation values, what have you seen in your work as you're out across the landscape working with producers?
So we've done a bit of work with Dr. Jeff Goodwin outside of Texas A&M's Center for Grazing Lands and Ranch Management, and they actually did a report for us looking at like, is there value to grazing management plans? And the the short answer would be the skeptics, right? Like of, well, it's just a piece of paper. No, but the long answer and the more like empowering answer is like, is yes, it's the process of planning. It's the process of putting that plan on paper that has the value because it gets your mind working and thinking about your ranch and your plan and how you're like working with your animals in that land in a way that like maybe you haven't thought about it before. And it starts giving you like that ability, right, to like to rethink what you've been doing and maybe like create new opportunities, try new things, see what works, see what doesn't work, and be able to adapt more readily to the different changes that you might be presented with. And like to Steve's point, right, if you need to go to market a little bit earlier because you see something coming up, like you're able to adjust to that quicker because you've got that plan and you know your land like that much more intimately because you've gone through that process. So that's really been like the value that we've seen and that others have seen when we talk about planning. It's that it gives you that power of really knowing what you're doing on that land in your operation very intimately.
Yeah, I love Steve's analogy of like you wouldn't run a business. I mean, you would be running a business if you didn't have a plan because cattle ranches at the end of the day do a lot of great things, but they are also businesses, right? Um, so let's just go to the next slide, Susan, and see. I think that the information that we found in our work together sort of validates what you all are saying, especially that sort of living plan versus sort of locked-in framework. So about a third of ranchers that we surveyed in preparation for doing all of this told us that they'd consulted their grazing management plan at least once a week. And so that sounds like constantly going back and checking inventory of assets and the environment in which I am operating, not unlike you would look at labor or water or anything else. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Okay. Let's go to the next slide because I think one of the things that was really interesting was the way that we were able to use our data to actually see the differences between the people who didn't have a plan, had a plan but wasn't written down, and did have it written down. And so this is all in our report that we'll make sure people have QR codes to be able to see. But one of the things is that we do see some stark differences in the data between folks who have a written plan and folks who don't. So Susan, I'm going to ask you to flip back and forth between the two slides here, but let me start with this one. So just, grounding everyone again, the ranchers with the written plan were just a smaller portion. It was about 10% of all ranchers. It was about 44 million acres. We saw that that from a average head of beef, they were good size operations. We can see the demographic and the geographic information here, where they're distributed, in that map, where you would expect them to be in cattle country. But another thing that our data was able to do was actually kind of delve into how are these folks making decisions and what's important to them and what's interesting to them. For folks looking at the screen, if you look at the bottom half of the screen, you start to see what we call sort of psychosocial or human dimensions kind of information about these people. And we start to see like, here's the kind of information that they're looking for from educational sources like frugality or succession planning, which we'll talk about in a bit, or risk management. But we can also start to see their attitudes towards change. And the one that stands out to me in that top right is that they're ambitious and driven in their careers. So it makes sense to me that they have taken the effort and the time to like sit and write down a plan for managing their business. We can also see that they are pretty comfortable with technology. So I don't know if they're using your web app, Sam, or not, but they're very comfortable with digital technology. They're probably comfortable with ag tech across their ranch, and that they are influenced by and influence others around them. So Susan, if you go to the next slide. Now we get to those folks, that 40% of ranchers that have a plan in their head, but haven't written it down. You can see just from the map again, cattle country, more western parts of the United States. I think Steve touched on one of the reasons for this, right? You know, people have had to plan where there has been drought. It has been impossible to stay in business without doing that to some degree. But we see some differences in how they think and in how they operate, even though from an operational standpoint, they're not that drastically different, like not that many, much bigger, not that much different in terms of gross farm income, but pretty different in how they're making decisions. So these folks, growth and innovation is the top of their interest list. But when we go down to the bottom here, their attitudes towards change, far less comfortable. Attitudes towards technology and their comfort level with technology, also less comfortable. And then the degree to which they're influenced and influencing others, also less comfortable. And so we can actually see that not only uh, are there folks who have a written plan and folks who have an unwritten plan, but that they might be thinking and making decisions and behaving differently. So we walked through all of this with you all when the data first came out. Sam, I'm curious, when you saw this, did it surprise you? Did it validate anything for you? How did you react to it?
I think I mean, it was just well, for me personally, I'm not a social scientist, so I like numbers and hard data. So for me, it was just something I'd never even considered. But when you start to really think about it, it does make sense to your point of what Steve was sharing, you know, of like needing to think through like what are the risks and managing for like drought and different conditions that are more frequent in the western part of the US, right? Like it makes sense to be having that plan, constantly thinking about it. I think for me, something that not growing up in agriculture that was surprising to me was the idea of having a plan that's in your head and not written. Because you know, like if I'm trying to like track my meals, I can't remember what I ate yesterday, you know, like if I'm not writing it down, I have no idea. Like so if you were asking me to run a cattle operation and I didn't write down what I did last season, oh my goodness. So a lot of surprises here for me personally. And I think for us as an organization, it just gave a lot of really, really good insights into how do we think about these different communities of ranchers, and then how do we best access them? Like every time I look at these slides, I get new nuggets of information, you know, that different things that spark me on like what are the levels of trust in the different mediums, right? Of like where should we be reaching them when we're thinking about communicating about grazing management and all of that. It's I mean, this is just a wealth of information.
Feel that way. And I have looked at these slides a lot. Steve, same thing. Like you practically have been in this space for the entirety of your life. Did it make sense? Did it bring up any new ideas or thoughts for you when we started dividing the world this way?
It was surprising, Amy. I guess I was blessed that in college I was introduced to this with Alan Savory, with his new concept, and then through our area that we're in, we had a very active soil conservation district that was advancing continuous learning. But this one surprised me. I know a lot of ranchers that are in this category and work with them on a basis. We share work at critical times of the year with our families, and I would promise you that they have a notebook or a book in their pocket or on the dash of their pickup, and they have every calf's birth date born, the cow number that the calf was born to, last year's weaning weights, all kinds of data about the animals themselves. And yet at the same time, when it comes to a written grazing management plan, they're hesitant to go ahead and engage a little bit, but they're already versed and talented in record keeping and planning, because they're planning bull selection, they're planning heifer retention and doing all that. And it's so I think there's high opportunity to help get to that point, that this is just another one of those steps of managing the overall operation. And this is a component of it that has value.
Does the idea that folks who don't have it written down have less of a comfort or affinity or inclination for technology in general sort of resonate with you all? This seems to be a burgeoning area of support for folks. There are certainly great tools out there for those of folks who do want to sort of manage their ranch operations, including grazing management. Is this a technology issue in your heads at all?
I'm
Let
not
Steve
sure,
go.
Amy, that it's necessarily a technology issue because the NCBA Red Book gives you the
Example.
outline to just start your very basic. And then every soil conservation district, every NRCS office has staff that are willing to help with simple paper documents or get you going on it. Everything that we tried to include in the US Roundtable is as simple as that to help you get started without a lot of technological complexity. Then if you want to go on to that level and maybe bring in a AgriWeb or some of the private consultants that do this, that's that advanced learning level that once you've taken those first steps and now you're curious about how far can I take this, go forward with it, those are available out further. And that's where maybe the technology part comes in, is you're talking about putting everything online and then having consultation back as they're looking at what you're doing. And you brought in a third party that has a desire to help you achieve a better scale.
I think it's also just kind of a cultural shift we'll see over time, right? You know, there is that feeling of, well, this is just how we've always been doing it. You just know it's how you've been doing it, so it's in your head and you keep going that way. And it's helping kind of make that shift of the realization, like there's power in getting that plan put to paper, right? To Steve's point in his opening comments about the growing carbon markets and these different like ecosystem service sort of things, that like if you're tracking and able to like plan out, there's different opportunities there that are starting to open up as well. So it's even like steps further of not only like managing your land and maybe opening up to different ways that you never thought of rotating your animals, but it's also giving you data that might one day come in handy for a new diversified something.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, I'm gonna again encourage folks to put questions, comments, thoughts in the chat or the Q&A. I'm not gonna stop until I see stuff, but when I see stuff, I will stop. So let's go to the next slide. Um, let's flip through that. Again, like pretty big difference geographically. So you see the impact of drought here on ranchers without the grazing management plan in general. But again, and smaller operations, which is also, a function of geography. But you can also see that how they're thinking and how they're seeing themselves look different. Though internally we were calling this, folks with cows rather than cattle ranchers. Because of the way that they, looked at their entirety of their operation. All right, let's flip to the next slide. One of the things that was an interesting hypothesis for us is like, are the people who are writing it down just planners by nature? And is there, something to tap into that that we can help folks with? If you're just not naturally a planner, then that's a good thing to know. So one of the things that we looked at was succession planning. And we did see a notable difference between folks who had a written grazing management plan and whether they had a succession plan, and those without a written grazing management plan and succession planning. So again, there does seem to be something about sort of the psychology of writing things down and planning it, because we do see that the folks who had a plan written down were also the ones that were substantially more likely to have a succession plan in place, which is also, as we know, not an easy process or thing to consider for many, many complex reasons, right? Did anything here pop out to you all when we saw this?
Amy, I felt like it pretty well mirrored what I see in our contemporaries when we have discussion about it. Within Colorado Cattlemen's Association, we found this to be so important that, like the roundtable, we made it a part of our services that we provide, is getting them in touch when they're curious about it, getting them in touch with counselors or legal folks that can help draft those planning documents. And so in both organizations, they took this very serious, and it mirrors what we see in the country.
Yeah. We have another one of our past chairs, Debbie Lyons Blythe, likes to say that the grazing management plan is like that natural piece of the succession plan. Like you can't have a succession plan if your grazing management plan isn't part of it. So I mean it makes sense. I would love to see that number higher too. And that's an area where we're working more on the roundtable side, as well as thinking through developing resources that support both improvement in operational financial health as well as succession planning, because they all go hand in hand.
Fabulous. Okay. Well, we're getting some good questions in, so I'm going to turn to that. Thank you all, and the audience here. So let's just talk about the mechanics of writing a plan. One of our guests here said, I have the feeling, or I have had the feeling, that I have to know how much grass I have and understand stocking rates before I start writing a plan. It sounds like you have information available to start at ground zero. Sam, is that true?
Yeah. Yeah, the module will walk through that stocking rate and all of that is a foundational piece of that. There's also, I don't know if it's up yet on the NCBA webpage, but part of what stemmed from this work was we worked with NCBA to develop a resource on utilizing a grazing stick, and developed a subsequent like tool pamphlet for that that has a lot of good information there too. I can see if I can pull that up, but the module that we've created does walk through the foundational elements of how do we know, how do we calculate stocking rate, how much forage do we have.
Steve, when you help people get started, what do you think they absolutely have to have in order to get started?
And I'm going to go back to some of my prior mentors, like Dave Pratt or Bert Teichert, and they were emphatic that you determine what's your operation's weakest link. Yeah, our goal is to get to managing resources, so pasture resources. But in order to get there, sometimes is water distribution, like in the Western US. Do we have enough water to begin to change to a rotational grazing plan and getting longer rest periods? In other areas, do we have other issues relative to the forages, like in Missouri and further east, where you've got high growth rates? You may have invasive species that are your biggest challenge to take care of first before you start with stocking rate and then forage, learning to calculate the amount of forage that you have available at the time. So working on what you think is your weakest link, what's the first thing that you've got to do in order to make your next step successful? Then you move forward with any number of tools that we've talked about here, that you can begin to learn to estimate your standing material and how many days that will allow you to be in that particular pasture. Or do I need to divide a pasture because I've got one large 160 acre pasture in Kentucky, and it might be easier to use electric fence or virtual fence to divide that pasture and then graze it in quarters or so. So there's lots of ways to begin to go with that. But like I said, determine your weakest link. Can you afford to make a change at this time? And do you need to do some infrastructure change before you make that change?
For wise. Another one of the questions was, has the panel done any proof of concepts on a spatial technology to address this need? I'm curious how you guys would answer that, because I think of this as a human problem. But when we think about spatial technology, pasture mapping, sure, that's probably what they're referring to. What are you seeing working or valuable in that space?
Well, we're already working in that space with the folks at Enrich Ag, who are members of the roundtable, and we're using ground cameras, and I can capture, whereas I was using 100-foot line transects to do hand measuring, I can now drive a complete circle in the pasture and capture an efficient distribution of a pasture, and by covering 50% of the pasture on a UTV or a vehicle. And then Earth Optics is now using drones, and they'll come in and they'll fly your pastures and get that data. So we've kind of gone past trying to do it with satellites, but using nearer ground pictures that give us a better distribution of species composition, percent of bare ground, and potential standing, whether it's 500 pounds per acre dry matter basis or 1,500 pounds. So I'm finding that those are going to be pretty valuable tools in helping us make decisions about, for us this year, but we'll be making decisions about 2026. 2025 is set. Now we're planning for 2026. So how do we move the cows to make sure that there's plenty of forage going into 2026?
Yeah, that amazing technology advances, certainly in understanding the asset that you have in real time, right? Which must be incredibly, incredibly helpful. So I'm just going to wrap up here, and I'm going to ask you all each for sort of a conclusion at the end of this. But Susan, if you'll flip to the next slide. I don't know, Steve and Sam, if you guys have even seen all of this data, but one of the things that I love about the grazing management plan is that it's a leading indicator rather than a lag indicator of someone being prepared to do something, right? I think that you all have expressed that incredibly well. One of the things that we do here at Trust in Food is we really are looking to identify and put information in people's hands about what is going to happen, not what has happened, because that's the basics of all things in agriculture, really. And so one of the things that our team just did was bumped up against those folks who are not planning. So that's the map on the left, and where do you find them? And then those folks who economic trends and credit scores and other economic indicators would indicate are in areas that are at the highest risk of being consolidated. So this doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to lose ranch land, but it does mean that we are seeing the number of producers who can make a livelihood shrink every year in America. And so that consolidation of who's going to thrive and who's going to fall behind becomes really important. And we do see this overlap between, where are folks who are not really planning ahead and thinking in this way, and where are folks who are potentially at risk. And at Farm Journal, we want to keep American farms farming and American ranches ranching. And so we're trying to get ahead of this trend. So I'll just go to my last slide here of data. Next slide, please. Oops, back one slide, sorry. So we also looked at where are ranchers seeing where do we see that ranchers are ready to make change? That could be putting a plan in place, increasing their grazing, implementing a new technology, or working with their NRCS official. Can be anything, right? And we can sort of measure where are folks showing that they're ready to make changes and where they're not. And again, grazing management plans look like a great leading indicator to indicate folks who are ready for the future, ready to make change, ready to avoid the forces of economic consolidation. So I just wanted to show you all that because it feels like this tool, this planning process becomes a really, really powerful indicator of how well someone is set up for success. And so I hope that as folks listen to us, they realize how important and powerful these tools can be. So with that, Susan, I'll ask you to go to the next slide. And so what are we going to do next? And so what we've all agreed to do together is continue to update and track against the baseline of how many acres are under grazing management plans. We'll do that sort of in a pulse basis on a regular basis, and then issue regular reports together as well. But I want you all to have the last word. Susan, maybe flip to the next slide, which is one that has resources for our guests. But where do you go from here? What's in the works? How are you going to use this to actually help reach your goals? Sam?
Yeah. So we're working right now within the roundtable. We're starting a new task force that Steve is helping with to develop, we're calling it a producer outreach task force, but really thinking through how do we reach more producers on the ground in more effective ways to help support on grazing management, and really thinking about how do we build out more networks to support uptake of grazing management plans. So I think that's the big next step for us, is just really trying to leverage the great work that you guys have done, the expertise that we have the pleasure of working with every single day, to help us and partner with to really support just really getting that cultural shift right around uptake of grazing management plans. And I know Steve has a lot more even than that going on personally beyond what he's doing to support the roundtable.
So Amy, I wish I had 10 volunteers in every state. And I think Mike Williams, the chair of our task force, feels at least the same way. And so what I see and what you provided for us, and I hate to make it sound like we're not going to try to reach everybody, but to get some sort of momentum rolling and keep that enthusiasm and that peer-to-peer performance that really seems to be a standard in our industry. We're looking at where's the low-hanging fruit that you've described for us here. Where are the ones most likely to get engaged with some more information and create that flow of adoption that we hope creates momentum? And as you get that momentum going, you're going to start picking up some of those that are hesitant to do it. I think we'll get neighbor to neighbor. I think we'll get state to state as adoption takes place and performances are better. I mean, there's nothing that makes a farmer rancher change than you look across the fence and either the corn is better or the grass is better, and you ask why, and they tell you this is what I'm doing that's different than that, and why try to reinvent the wheel yourself when your neighbors and others are helping you find the answer to the solution. So you've given us some good places to start and work in the next few years and get that low-hanging fruit and turn it into some momentum.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that is the goal. These kinds of goals can seem audacious, but there's two things that you need. You need to know where to start and where to focus, because there's, limited resources and time and energy. And so hopefully we've been able to start there. And then, hopefully, because we have a data set that says more specifics around grazing management and how ready producers are, that we can get more folks sort of contributing towards the same goal. And I think that's one of the things that the power of the roundtable really brings to bear is, folks working against those common goals, and sort of putting all of our shoulder to the wheel together. So with that, I think we are about out of time. I do want to just mention that for the producers who are in the audience with us still and have stuck with us, Trust and Beef has a lot of peer-to-peer network resources, sustainable ranch tours, ways to rub shoulders with the practice and to hear from others that have done this. So please take a look and keep an eye out for, where we are coming both on the ground and then in other ways that we're connecting folks peer to peer as well. But in the meantime, Sam and Steve, thank you so much for joining us. This was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Okay.
much. It was
All
an
right.
honor.
Thank you. Thanks for your great work. Okay. Thanks everyone for tuning in. See you soon.